Hello and good morning, everybody. How are we today? Good? Okay, great. Well, my name is Brittany Grant. I am the Director of Business Development at The Hill, and welcome to this morning's event, Policy Prescriptions Lowering Drug Prices. Before we get started, I would like to begin by thanking our underwriter for this morning's conversation, AARP. Thank you for making this possible. For many Americans, the rising drug prices are taking a toll not only on their wallets, but also on their health. As patients struggle to afford out-of-pocket costs and premiums, leaders in Washington and in more than 20 states across the country are moving forward to put policy solutions into place. From increasing access to generic drugs and promoting transparency to allowing the government to negotiate lower drug prices, there are several plans under construction. What bipartisan efforts hold the greatest promise? And at the same time, what steps can stakeholders take to reduce the burden on patients? All very important questions. This morning, we will look forward to hearing from senators on both sides of the aisle who are spearheading legislation on Capitol Hill to make drugs more affordable for patients across the country. Before we get started, we have a few quick housekeeping notes. In addition to our audience in the room here, thank you for joining us. We are also live streaming on thehill.com. So please keep your phones on silent throughout the duration of the program. But we do encourage you to participate and engage in conversation on social media. You can do that by following us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, at The Hill Events, and join the conversation using the hashtag TheHillRxPricing. We're going to be taking questions during the program and are eager for your participation. So during that portion, please be on the lookout for members of our team with handheld mics. Finally, you will receive an electronic survey following the conclusion of today's events, and we are always eager here at The Hill to hear how we can make our events more dynamic. So I encourage you to take a few minutes to provide your feedback on today's program. So with all of that, let's dive right in. And we're going to begin this morning with Senator Tammy Baldwin, a Democrat from Wisconsin. Senator Baldwin has served 7 terms in the House before being elected to Senate in 2012. She currently serves on the Senate Health, Appropriations, and Commerce Committees. Senator Baldwin is a sponsor of the Fair Drug Pricing Act that requires drug manufacturers to disclose and provide more information about planned drug price increases, including research and development costs. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you.
We look forward to hearing more about your work on drug pricing and other healthcare issues that matter to Wisconsinites and all Americans. Joining Senator on stage is my colleague Steve Clemens, the Hill's editor-at-large.
Hey everybody, good to be with you this morning. I'm going to tell all the folks on the stage that I'm willing to auction these 3 chairs off on eBay. Any of you can come up if you want to hang out in front. Just come on up in front and sit. So if you ladies want to come up or guys, come on up. Don't be shy. So hey, good morning,
Good
Senator.
morning.
Great to be with you. I was thinking last night. I had this weird dream about drug pricing.
Yeah. Nightmare or a dream?
Well, it depends, And I think some of you may remember, maybe the millennials in the room will not, but there used to be this really cool thing called Schoolhouse Rock. And there was this story about how a bill becomes a law. But in my convoluted brain last night, I was wondering how a drug gets a price. Yeah. And so I thought we could have a Schoolhouse Rock, maybe AARP could do the Schoolhouse Rock version of how a drug gets a price. So how do you want a drug to get a price?
Well, I would love it if there were true market forces and competition always at play, but it is an absolutely opaque process. The manufacturer does set the list price, but then a lot of things begin to happen behind that veil of secrecy. And it's actually been one of my missions to follow the dollar, and no one can give me an answer. By way of an example, our Secretary of Health and Human Services is actually a former drug company executive. He was an executive at Eli Lilly. I remember early on in his tenure as secretary, I had a chance to question him in my service on the Help Committee, and I was explaining the story of one of my constituents, a father whose both of his sons have type 1 diabetes. Now, Eli Lilly makes insulin. They're one of the 3 major producers of insulin. And so I was explaining that this constituent, Greg, had seen rapid increases in the price, the list price, and out-of-pocket price for his two sons' insulin, the test strips, everything else. It was close to or surpassing $1,000 a month. And on his income, he didn't know how he was going to be able to go on. And he certainly was concerned about his sons as they grew up and had to manage these costs themselves. And so I said, Mr. Secretary, what do I tell my constituent Greg about the price of insulin and why it's increased, doubled in the last 5 years, the time period we're talking about? And his answer literally was, well, it's complicated. And I said, I can't call up Greg after this hearing
Did
and
he
say,
stick with that answer, or did he
Yeah.
like file an answer later?
No. Recently, I had the chance to ask him whether the department could produce for me a follow the money chart. So the request I had is, say there's a drug right now where the list price is $100 a month. And then you quadruple it to $400 a month. I want to figure out, how does the dollars held in each hand in this whole complicated system change? Who pockets that new $300?
So in the process of all of this, because
By the way, they have not been able to answer that
They have
question.
not been able to answer that. So I guess I would ask in that, because I've also tried to follow the dollar, tried to understand, and we've had, whether it was EpiPen or various kinds of things
Yes.
pop in the market about cost. And what I've been, I used to ask this at some events at my former journalistic home and say, who's the villain in the story? And who are the heroes, who are the villains? And it seems to me that there are lots of shades of gray in terms of the black hats, if you will, in the sense that when you ask that question of where the dollars, there are PBMs, there are insurance
Yes.
providers, there are others, and so when you look
There's
at
discounts, there's rebates, there's full price.
And just last night, I was with some folks in the pharmaceutical industry, and they said, look, in the insurance area, the sensitivity, the political sensitivity, is from the out-of-pocket expenses, what people are feeling when they're paying for something, when they're on the front end of that. And so, I guess my question is, a lot of us talk about the brand name we know or the brand behind the drug. Why aren't we talking as much about other parts of that ecosystem, the insurers, the PBMs, the distributors who provide, each one of them has a part of the drug getting a price?
Well, the manufacturer sets the list price. And then the negotiations and bargaining that goes on flows from there. The PBM is trying to assure market share. We don't know what those negotiations look like. I would love to have that transparency. I think we'd set better policy if we had the actual and specific knowledge of what happens. But again, the list price starts with the manufacturer, and that's where I start.
I was doing my typical research on things that I could find that your office didn't share with me. And one of them comes out of the Wisconsin Examiner. It's a very moving story about Aiden Abbott. From Slinger, Wisconsin. And he has, as I understand it, ectodermal dysplasia, which creates a lot of oral care, reconstructive surgery over time. And this kid essentially has no insurance, or they have very little. The payment for it is, maybe they do have insurance, but the payment for it is extraordinarily costly. And so you've got something called the Ensuring
Lasting
Smiles Act.
Yes.
So tell me about that, because I sometimes wonder if we're forgetting about people behind these discussions about drug
Yes.
pricing and cost. What is the Aiden Abbott story?
Well, I met Aiden as a real brand new senator. So he was young. He was a part of the Abbott family, who are enormous advocates, and they actually have good health insurance through Aiden's dad. Ectodermal dysplasia has all sorts of symptoms and presentations, but a common line in all of this is that they'll need dental reconstructive surgery throughout life. And so most of his surgeries have been covered almost in full, except for the orthodonture and the dental surgery. And the Aiden family has found that they're paying that out of pocket. the other families that they have connected with and organized into quite a wonderful advocacy group face the same challenges. And so the idea behind the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act is that we would mandate that this isn't a cosmetic type of procedure. This is something that will affect the proper functioning of the jaw, and it involves being able to eat and all sorts of things like that. And Aiden named the bill.
Oh.
Yes, which is, and its nickname, because we also have an acronym, is ELSA,
Okay.
but the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act. And it's garnered bipartisan support over the years as the families affected have come in for lobby days to meet with their representatives and
So again, this
senators.
is just another story of people. I mean, it's not.
Yeah.
This may be a different dimension of health pricing, if you will, as opposed to drug pricing, but another element of humans and what being citizens and what they can afford or not afford. And so when you in your Fair Drug Pricing Act, which is, let's make the leap from that to the Fair Drug Pricing Act, which you have put forward. What are the human stories there? And just give us the quick snapshot of what needles you think are most important to move in fair drug pricing.
Well, I told you already about Greg and his two sons with juvenile diabetes. Probably one of the biggest constituent advocates I have for the Fair Drug Pricing Act is a woman named Diane Whitcraft. She has multiple sclerosis, and she's had that diagnosis for nearly 30 years. She was prescribed a drug produced by Bayer Corporation that slows the progression of her MS symptoms. And she took it continually for 23 years. She had occasion to change health insurance. And when she got her new health insurance, she was looking at the drug formulary, and her drug was not included on it, which meant she would have the out-of-pocket prices. So she looked in, I think she said that she and her husband said, oh, we'll pay for it out of pocket, we'll figure out what it costs. Well, when she first started taking it, it was roughly $10,000 a year. Today, it's roughly $90,000 a year. Her copay wouldn't have been the full amount of that, but she and her husband had one of those talks you would never wish upon anybody. Whereby she decided she was going to stop taking it because the copay would have begun to really, move into their retirement savings. And Diana is just one of those powerful stories of what explains a drug that hasn't changed. They haven't improved it or, changed its color or its dosage. This is the same drug as she started taking, but it's gone from 10,000 to 90,000.
So is this, I know one element of this is you begin to try to get reports on price increases of greater than 10%. Senator Alexander is saying, hey, what if they do 9%, and they're trying to oppose it that way. But is this largely you're trying to sort of get a reporting and highlight on price increases over time? Absolutely,
and the components. We ask for a lot of detail because a drug like I was just describing, you can't really put R&D, they haven't changed it at all. Insulin has not changed I don't think their ingredient or manufacturing cost for the drug itself has changed substantially. But let's see. For example, Pfizer got a multi-billion-dollar tax break with the 2017 tax legislation. Did they lower the price of any of their drugs because of that? No, they're mostly stock buybacks. And I think the consumer and the public, and certainly policymakers, ought to know about that in more detail. How much is being spent on marketing, direct-to-consumer advertising? How much is being spent on R&D? We value R&D. We'd love to hear that that was, one of the major contributors, but we fear that it isn't as much a share anymore.
How do you weigh the other side of it? So Lilly, since you mentioned Lilly, for instance, lost several $billion in an Alzheimer's-related drug that looked promising. There's a PBS series, or PBS show out about that, where you go through it, and it's really a fascinating kind of anthropological look of the hope in this Alzheimer's drug. And Alzheimer's is going to become a huge issue in this country, and so investing in that, taking the risk, I think, is an important part of the partnership. I hear it is what NIH. I know your grandfather was an NIH researcher as well.
Yeah.
And so when you are in that area and trying to promote more and more research in something a needed area, here Lilly lost that. And I don't think, when you kind of talk about it, I don't know many people know about the failures as well that drug companies have. They usually hear about the successes and the profit, but very rarely about the failures. So how do you build in awareness of the risk side? I think the pharma companies would raise that as a part of the story.
And I'd love to see all the details. As I say, there's a veil of secrecy along the chain, whether it's manufacturer to PBM to pharmacy benefit managers, for anyone who doesn't know, but I'm sure your audience is all aware of that. Insurance companies, Medicare, Medicaid, consumer out-of-pocket, there's a whole chain here. But I would love to have detail on those things. And I also want to know what public funds, NIH funds, contributed to some of the breakthroughs and failures. Frankly, I think we would be very well benefited from knowing that. A lot of the research goes on with partnerships between pharmaceutical companies and academics, research academics across the globe, but certainly a lot of it NIH and taxpayer funded in the United States. You mentioned my grandfather was a NIH-funded scientist. He also got some of his funding in the early days from pharmaceutical companies. I had once asked about, did he have any patents? And I found out that he did. He had isolated an enzyme. Merck has that, right? And I think now we have legislation that Bidol that allocates that a little bit better than we did in the old days, but it's something that we should have more transparency into. And so I'd push back by saying, don't use this as an excuse not to have price transparency and accountability.
Well, there's so many different words. I think the Bayh-Dole Act actually brought a lot of university research in, created equity opportunities for universities.
Yes.
And you saw this explosion of research and technological advancement in health, but in many other areas as well.
Yes, indeed.
So, that's the Bayh-Dole Act for those of you who don't know. But sometimes I wonder, do we need another Bayh-Dole Act? Because you get the sense that we're sitting on the verge of all these technological possibilities of really life-changing and humanity-changing possibilities that are sitting on one of the most fragile, politically divisive healthcare debates in the world. And so I wonder, are we going to actually undo this promise on one hand of research and development by making bad choices on the other side? And so how do you handle that tension between innovation and research on one side and getting affordability and access for people in the broad healthcare system?
Well, what we're talking about, I start with transparency. If there's not a policymaker around who can actually follow the dollar and explain what happens, how are we going to find the right pressure points? As one of my colleagues, Republican colleagues, was mentioning of late, this is one of the only systems where an increase in price seems to create greater demand. Usually it is the other way around. It is not working like a functioning market.
Now, Senator Grassley and Senator Wyden dropped this bill on drug pricing in anticipation of our forum today. And I, am wondering, are you on board with what they're doing?
So I think they're marking up today. Even,
right, they're marking up,
also.
right, yeah, in just about an hour.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of focus on particular payers, so public payers. They're obviously their jurisdiction is Medicaid and Medicare, and I think it's going to be a great discussion. I would not opt for it in lieu of the Fair Drug Pricing Act, which I don't think I bragged yet. Got adopted through committee, and
Yay, congratulations!
Yes,
Yay.
thank you. It was a very strong bipartisan vote. on the amendment that was the Fair Drug Pricing Act. It was 16-7 in our Health Committee. And so, good chances
So your
of
answer
lasting.
is the Fair Drug Pricing Act is better than what?
I think it's the toughest and most, holds these companies more accountable than all of the other ones that we're looking at that won't get us those bottom line answers of following the dollar.
Do you think Donald Trump is on the right side of things in this discussion?
Well, I certainly think that his call for lower drug prices and calling out the actors who have the greatest control is important, as using the bully pulpit. So far, I have not seen the proposals that he's tried to push through on the executive side bear any fruit. And he's kind of said otherwise. I mean, I've heard him in fora say that he has brought down drug prices, and that's not what we're seeing. They launched a second initiative relating to ending rebates and then drew that back. And so, I hope that he will get fully briefed on what we're doing right now in the House and the Senate and Help Committee and Finance Committee and get behind these efforts. And I do think, it starts with transparency.
My former colleague Jim Hamlin at The Atlantic, kind of did a quick survey, which I'll read because it's kind of amusing, on Donald Trump's calls to action on this. And he says in March of last year, Trump said, "You'll be seeing drug prices falling very substantially in the not too distant future, and it's going to be beautiful." And then just 10 months later in the State of the Union said, this had already happened as a result of my administration's effort. In 2018, drug prices experienced their single largest decline in 46 years. So what's going on there?
I can't tell you.
Okay. But
I
as
wish I could.
Yeah, as we think, we're going to go to the audience in just a moment, kind of get this. But as we think about, been talking to various friends, and some of whom are in the audience, about how do we move the needle for real people who are experiencing this? And when you kind of go in, I interviewed Doris Matsui the other day on drug pricing and kind of Medicare Part D and the donut hole and how cost prices. And right now we seem to be in there seems to be a lot of dust in the air that's been thrown up by a lot of action. And I'm interested at the end of the day, what do you think is most likely, maybe your act, but what are the most likely parts of a deal that are going to come out? Your Republican colleagues and what they can live with. You know where the White House is, and you know what people need. And how much are we going to get actually something, in this Congress that's going to respond to real people on the drug pricing front?
Let me say, first of all, that the Help Committee bill that was reported out 20-3 looks beyond the drug pricing question.
Right.
So it looks at other aspects of bipartisan legislation that can lower prices. And it actually is a really bipartisan product. I think the Finance Committee is looking more specifically at drug pricing, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if you see amendments in committee offered to also include Medicare negotiation, something that at least at one point the president had said he favors. Whether or not that can make it through, I'm not sure. But I think that what we would most likely see passed are the things that have achieved bipartisan support thus far. And I also think, especially when this comes to the Senate floor, that we will want to remind people that the biggest threat facing us right now in the healthcare arena is the fact that while the president talks about lowering drug prices, he is currently in court suing to take away, to overturn the Affordable Care Act, which would actually deprive millions of people of their private insurance and get rid of protections for people with pre-existing health conditions. So that's, in my mind, the biggest threat. All of our actions on lowering prices could be for naught if the president and his cohort is successful in this lawsuit. And that, I try to raise the alarm bells every time I can.
My team's going to get upset with me because I know I need to go to the audience, but just I wanted to test something, and I had heard from some pharmaceutical CEOs that, in this kind of ecosystem of them trying to answer the question that Alex Azar may not have been able to tell you, they said, sometimes it makes sense for people to leave their plan, that if they have a plan and they go in with their insurance, they go to Walgreens or CVS, and they pay whatever copay they may have, it may actually be cheaper for them to check out the cash price. This is bizarre. I'd never thought of that because I'm so programmed to think, well, I've got insurance-provided health care, go in and do whatever. So I actually knew somebody that was on prescription drugs. We went down to Walgreens, I tested it out, and sure enough, in this particular case with this particular drug, if they just paid cash, they'd be paying less than the copay with what they were doing. I didn't know that. And so there's a real literacy issue and an issue of information, and I'm just, and so at that moment, I felt very disarmed and kind of like a victim in this, and so and then I will really go to the, how do you fix that? Because that seemed to be so simple. Do a campaign, people check out the cash price, or, I guess part of that is transparency, but there's another part of it that we are so programmed not to ask questions. As a citizen or as a consumer of healthcare, at least I don't ask questions. I know people in the audience do, but I just do what I'm told.
Yeah.
But in this, the cash price was was cheaper.
Right. And that is not always the case, I will assure you. I think people would ask questions a lot more if they thought they could get answers to those. Now that's a very specific, go to the counter, how much will it cost if you bill this through my insurance? How much will it cost if I just pay cash? But in many cases, you could go to the pharmacist and say, well, how is that possible? And they can't trace it backwards because, again, the information simply is not available. When I was in my first couple of years in the Senate, there was a big article, I think, in Time about what you might be billed for a hospital stay if you had no insurance, you had Medicare, you had private insurance, and it wasn't the same. And sometimes the people without insurance had, if you look at the detailed billing, had higher prices for the Band-Aid, for the IV, for whatever, than the people with insurance. It was remarkably inconsistent, illogical, and the reporter couldn't even get to the granular detail that we deserve. I just can't stress enough that this, if we're going to set policy and have guardrails for a system that's clearly not working as a true capitalist market, we need the information. We need to be able to follow the money.
Let's take a couple of quick questions. Questions, thoughts, right here in the front. I know we're going to get you a microphone. There are lots of people that
Thanks
want
for coming. I have a two-part question. One is Senator Braun on board with your push for transparency? And the second part is, if there are other senators who are not in favor of transparency, what can possibly be their arguments against transparency?
Yes.
Great question.
So Senator Braun is my Republican co-sponsor of the bill. So Baldwin Braun, Senator Murkowski, also a Republican, also on the HELP committee, and Senator Tina Smith. The four of us are sort of the, and I actually originally wrote the bill with John McCain. That's when I first introduced it a couple sessions ago. I think we've heard all sorts of different pushback. In the hearings that we've had on drug pricing, when we've had representatives of pharmaceutical companies in front of us, they've said, well, it's not that we're against transparency, but you have to have the transparency, with the PBM and the insurance companies and the pharmacies, and like, I don't disagree, but you set the list price, so we start here. And then we've had pushback about the reporting requirements, and will people be able to produce a report that actually gets to the data that we want? I have every confidence that we can do that DH&HS can require that and be clear about what is required in advance of increasing the price. Oh, and I forgot to mention when you said gaming it by doing 9%, 9%, 9%. We also, it's 10% a year or 25% in 3 years.
I see.
So they could do
24.
9, 9, yeah.
Yeah,
you
8,
got
8,
it.
right? So, and then I think lastly, another big question that comes up, oftentimes on the pharmaceutical side of this is, and I'm sensitive to it, is is there anything you're doing that might undermine the rare disease incentives for responding to rare disease, which are often smaller populations and thus much higher price points in terms of R&D and return, and kind of getting at, do you need to hive that off from some of what you're doing with, sort of more popular based, I suppose, or sort of wider spread drugs?
Well, I think not. I know that the House is looking at that as a possible amendment to their version of the Fair Drug Pricing Act. But to the degree that R&D for, say, an orphan drug is being spread across the drug portfolio of a company, I think that's something we need to know. And I also think, by the way, we in the United States seem to bear more of the burden of R&D than other countries that have different systems of setting those prices and negotiating those prices, et cetera. And we need to understand that also. But I also think that we need to bolster the government programs that support research into orphan drugs or rare diseases, because we can never, again, it's going to be one of those that's hard to address in a sort of capitalist system, because there's not going to be the return on investment, but we still want to incent that type of research and those type of breakthroughs that change lives.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you very
Appreciate
much.
it.